Hi, I'm Dr. Margaret Cook. I'm a lecturer at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland on the land of the Gubbi Gubbi people.
And I'm Dr. Scott McKinnon, and I work at the University of Wollongong on Darawal country. Margaret, you and I have collaborated quite a bit on some disasters research. Why do you think it's important to study the history of disasters?
In my research, I look at disasters like bushfire, flood, earthquakes, cyclones. And the reason for doing that is these are moments when society is in crisis. And in those moments, you can see tensions and power dynamics that are often hidden at different times. Stephen Pine, the fire historian, says that disasters help illuminate the character of both humans and the environment. At those times, you can see inequalities in race or religion or gender or sexuality. And it gives the historian the chance to ask some difficult questions. The time gives us the opportunity to look at paths we have taken and maybe think about things that we could do differently in the future. So when people talk about bushfires or floods or earthquakes, they call them natural disasters, but do you think they are actually natural?
And in that intermingling of the natural and the social, I think we can even interrogate the phrase natural disasters, which is a bit of a misnomer. Because if we think about, say, a storm that happens out at sea, there's nobody around, that's not going to be a disaster, that's a weather event. It only becomes a disaster if it, say, hits land and there's a vulnerable population there. And that will be a worse disaster if that population is particularly vulnerable in some way. Say it's a community that doesn't have the financial capacity to build storm-resistant housing. So that's why we define a disaster as a hazard, like a storm or a bushfire or a flood, plus vulnerability. And the causes of that vulnerability aren't natural. They're determined by social structures, by governance decisions, and by human behaviors and values. And so if we call a disaster natural, we kind of risk closing bigger conversations that we need to have about the root causes of disaster and of vulnerability. We might just kind of dismiss a disaster as natural. Oh, well, it's just natural. There's not much we can do about it as humans. But then what we actually need to be doing is addressing issues of social inequity, of thinking about how we can address the causes of climate change, which is creating more intense disasters and more frequent disasters, and having those big conversations about human behavior that exacerbates disaster and increases vulnerability.
So in my research, I've looked at the mud army. Now in 2011, Brisbane was flooded. The city was inundated. And on one weekend, thousands of volunteers poured into the streets carrying buckets and mops and spades to help those that were flooded. And the media labelled them the Mud Army, the Broom Brigade. But basically, these were a whole lot of people who'd come from the suburbs that had not been flooded into those that had been flooded to help clean up. And what this revealed was the inequalities in society. And I spoke to a woman who was in her 80s who'd lost everything. She'd lost her photographs, her piano, her jewellery, the things that we hold really dear. And they're the things that make up the fabric of our lives. And she'd lost the lot. And one weekend, people came into her home and they threw those possessions into a skip because they were covered in mud. But what it showed to me is that Brisbane's really reactive to floods. We know they're coming. It's actually been raining for days and the water's in the headwaters already, and they're moving down the river system, and they will come to Brisbane. And yet we seem to sit and wait for them to happen. And floods will come again. We live on a subtropical floodplain that is prone to flooding. And so we need to change the conversation. We need to stop being so reactive and become proactive. And so what I'd like to see next time is that rather than have a mud army that comes in after the event and helps clean up, maybe we could have a flood army. And these people would come in before the event and help the old lady move her jewellery, move her cat, move her photographs. And whilst her home will still be flooded, her possessions will be saved. And that will help make her life that little bit better in the future.